Okay. Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Friday, so it's Self-Improvement Friday. I'm delighted to have my friend John present every Friday on this topic. John, over to you.
Thank you. So yes, welcome everybody. Welcome back for everybody who is returning. I appreciate everybody spending their Friday evening here. Today we are talking about Voltaire's Candide, and I'm going to extract the principle of individualism versus collectivism with this as a backdrop. So if you haven't read Candide, it's perfectly fine. I'm going to summarize the relevant and necessary points that we need to summarize individualism versus collectivism. And then we're going to dive into some implications and applications and then discussion around these points. So Candide is from Voltaire, and it was actually a philosophical, I guess, counter argument to Leibniz's philosophy of, and this was in like, I don't know, mid 1600s. And Leibniz was I don't know much about him, but I believe he was like a mathematician / philosopher, and he was very religious in nature. So his like promulgation, his positing of arguments was, okay, if there is an all benevolent creator of the universe, everything that is subject to that, everything that is relegated, everything that is promulgated and extended from that must be all good. So in short, Voltaire was kind of disagreeing with this point. He says, no, not everything's all good. What about famine? What about warfare? What about suffering? What about sacrifice? What about betrayal? What about all of these unequivocally malicious and malevolent realities and phenomena that we experience in our daily lives or in our trajectory of a lifetime? So Candide was his fictional argument against that. Instead of just writing a philosophical essay, he decided to embody some philosophies and some principles in archetypes in character form, which I think is especially beautiful. And I always love when an author does that because there's a lot of room for interpretation here. So Candide is literally translated to optimism. And again, it was a philosophical treatise against the treatise that all is for the best. So Candide is a young man, and he's growing up in this like estate, and he has affinity or falls in love with this girl, and I think he ends up kissing her, but the girl's family was royalty or something along those lines. So he's kind of exiled and shunned away from his family, away from his civilization, away from his society, forced into military service, is treated very poorly, almost dies multiple times. And in the beginning of the story, Candide has this mentor, and his mentor's name was Pangloss. And Pangloss is meant to be a quintessence, be a embodiment of Leibniz's philosophy, all is for the best. That is all Pangloss keeps repeating, which by the way is translated to mean all talk, which was a kind of comical jab at from Voltaire. So Pangloss is kind of this like blind optimist, right? He's saying everything is perfect, there's nothing wrong in the world, everything that happens should happen, everything that happens we deserve, no matter how bad, no matter how miserable and poor our lives get, it's what we deserve. Everything is meant as it should be. So Candide goes along with this philosophy. He's kind of been indoctrinated in a sense to believe this, and throughout the entire story, the rest of the story, in an almost kind of redundant fashion, Candide comes across several challenges, several obstacles. He gets note and word of news that his lover, that he thinks she's been killed. His mentor, Pangloss, has been hung in some civilization, in some society. There has been like several military raids in certain cities. Everybody he's known or loved has been taken from him, or he thinks they've been killed. He eventually, someone's not muted, by the way. So throughout the entire story, he comes across all of these contributing obstacles. There's like warfare, there's famine, there's an earthquake, there's fire, there's mass death, there's hysteria, there's panic. And throughout this entire thing, Candide is like, oh, my mentor Pangloss, he's a philosopher. He must be right. He must be smart. Everything's for the best. I guess I need to shut up and not worry about it. And then there are some times where he begins to question the validity of this proposition, and he's saying, you know, maybe I should do something about this. Maybe I should actually intervene and express my will and make this situation and these circumstances, make them the best. Maybe they're not the best as they are, but what can I do about them? So that kind of leads me into the second point of this discussion here today, the implication. So with the nature of evil, with the nature of malevolence, with the nature of betrayal, natural disasters, with the nature of, you could say, evil in mind, how should we approach this thing? How should we approach evil? And the story actually ends with Candide actually reconvening and reconciling with his mentor Pangloss and with his lover Cunegonde. But there is still a, I guess, like seedling of doubt in terms of all is for the best. He doesn't really, he realizes that he was kind of looking at his lover Cunegonde through like, what's the phrase, rose-colored goggles when he was younger. She's not that attractive as she once was to him. It doesn't really seem that appealing to be in a partnership with her anymore. He's kind of stuck with her, and he's like, oh, it's kind of just banal and bland. And then at the end of the story, literally the final concluding statement is, let us cultivate but we must cultivate our garden. So I look at this as not literally cultivating a garden, but rather symbolic and allegorical to represent, okay, you have all of these things that are undesirable in the world. You have these malicious and malevolent circumstances that are going to express themselves on us. They're going to introduce themselves into our life, whether it's from our own neglect or our own consequences of our actions, or it's an external event. They're going to find our way into our lives. Now, what should we do from that? And I took this symbolically, let us cultivate our garden, as let us cultivate whatever we control. Let us focus on the locus of what is inside our control and act accordingly and cultivate and begin to bring that into fruition. So this leads me into the implication of today's discussion. And this is, again, how should we deal with the malevolence of the world? And we have two options. We have individualism or collectivism. So individualism is kind of placing high emphasis on, I would say, individual responsibility, adopting a sense of moral meaning, adopting burdens that we can carry, and also maybe carrying other people's as well, adopting our share of responsibility in the world. And collectivism is kind of relegating individual responsibility and heightening emphasis on collectively carrying a burden forward. Now, there's a lot of interpretations here, obviously, but I think one that really came out at me when I think of the term of collectivism is like, if something is everyone's fault, when you really want to get to specifics, nobody is to blame, right? So you can't really get down to the nitty-gritty solutions in terms of collectivism in most situations. I don't want to polarize this and say it's black and white. Of course, there's room for interpretation here. But on the most part, I would say with collectivism, if something is everybody's fault, like in society, whatever manifestation this problem happens to express itself through, if it's everyone's fault, you can't really place the blame on anybody, and you can't say, hey, you need to do that better, because these are the consequences of your actions as an individual. So look, we can trace this back, therefore you need to do this better. Whereas if you say it's everybody's fault, there's this kind of vague amorphous, oh, like we should do this. And that's frequently projecting. It's frequently not, it's turning a blind eye to what we know that we should do in our lives and kind of projecting our false sense of superiority on other people and saying, you guys need to get it together. I'm perfect, but all you guys are all messed up. All of you need to figure it out. Like, I'm good. My life's in order. You guys need to figure it out. So I want to dive into some implications of individualism here. And so going from the symbolism of let us cultivate our garden, it immediately made me think of a quote and a passage from Meditations from Marcus Aurelius, where he's talking about setting your corner of the universe in order. I'm going to read the passage in full because I thought this is so particularly thought-provoking and meaningful, and it really stayed within my memory when I read it, and I was able to recall it after I read Candide. So it's about a paragraph long, so I'll read from it here and we're going to discuss it. So Aurelius in Meditations says, in the morning when you rise unwillingly, let this thought be present. I am rising to the work of a human being. Why then am I dissatisfied if I'm going to do the things for which I exist and for which I was brought into the world? Or have I been made for this, to lie in my bedclothes and keep myself warm? But this is more pleasant, you might say. Do you exist then to take your pleasure and not at all for action or exertion? This is the important part. Do you not see the little plants, the little birds, the ants, the spiders, the bees working together to put in order their several parts of the universe? And art thou unwilling to do the work of a human being? And do you not make haste to do that which is according to your nature? And then he goes on with that. But I thought that was very meaningful. So he's positing it as like, if you look at every single thing as an individual entity, like even down to these really, really minute and minuscule details, the plants, the birds, the ants, the spiders, the bees, they are like executing on their share of responsibility for the totality of the world. And you can make a literal argument for that. Like you can trace the ecosystem from the fertilization of plants and the pollination of flowers back to bees, and they make a certain strain of, you know, vegetables or fruit possible. You can make a literal argument on that. And that's crazy to think about, because that one bee decided to, it didn't wake up and like decide it wanted to, you know, be warm in its bed, in its bedclothes, and just take a day off. No, it exerted itself. And it said, this is my responsibility. I'm taking my responsibility. I'm adopting this burden. I have a task in front of me that is meant for me. I'm going to execute on it because that is what I was made for. And that's a beautiful way to look at the universe. And if enough individual entities do that, you can look at a collective completely functioning in harmony, in order. So I thought that was very thought-provoking and meaningful. And you can superimpose this obviously to the fact of the individual life. So if we have things in our lives that we know that we should do and we neglect them, I think that leads to chaos. I think that leads to us, if we don't have our corner of the universe in order, that is taking away from the collective. Even if you look at it at a small percent, like you can't really conceptualize the whole train of cause and effect on if we execute on our responsibility or we ignore it. It's kind of hard because you could say, what's the difference? I'm one person, it doesn't matter, right? You can make that argument. But you can also say the other way. I'm one person, but I can have a ripple effect on millions if you trace it. You know, you can go both ways with that. And to think of the ripple effect point, I'm going to bring up a point from Jordan Peterson. He has a entire chapter actually dedicated to this. Rule 6, which is kind of set your house in perfect order before you try to criticize the world. And it's kind of congruent to what I was talking about with the bee. So he says, clean up your life. And this is the whole symbolism behind clean your room. If anybody knows Jordan Peterson, they've heard of clean your room, which is kind of symbolic to mean set your corner of the universe in order. He says, clean up your life. Consider your circumstances. Start small. Have you taken full advantage of the opportunities offered to you? Are you working hard on your career or your job? Or are you letting bitterness and resentment hold you back and drag you down? Have you made peace with your brother? Are you treating your spouse and your children with dignity and respect? Do you have habits that are destroying your health and well-being? Are you truly shouldering your responsibilities? Have you said what you need to say to your friends and family members? Are there things that you could do that you know you could do that would make things around you better? Have you cleaned up your life? That's a very, very fruitful line of questioning for us to all conceptualize. And he concludes with, don't blame capitalism, the radical left, or the iniquity of your enemies. Don't reorganize the state until you have ordered your own experience. So I think an encapsulation of this entire chapter is, again, set your house in perfect order before you try to criticize the world. So if you don't have your own, like these small corner of the universe in order, it's going to extrapolate from there. So if you operate in order, if you have, you know, as he's saying, your relationship in order, if you know you're shouldering your responsibilities that you should be doing, you're addressing yourself at work, you're having the uncomfortable conversations with your families or your friends or your coworkers or somebody that you want a promotion from, whatever it happens to be, your individual lot of responsibility. If you're doing all those things, okay, cool, then it's going to have a ripple effect, because men learn best at the school of example. Words are very hollow if they're not substantiated by action, okay? So we all know that there's very little utility, very little value in somebody saying that, you know, oh, you should be healthier, you should be more financially independent, and they're not, okay? So if they're speaking from a sense of you should do something and they haven't done that themselves, that's frequently psychological projection. And frequently what it's doing is ameliorating the sense of guilt and I guess regret and resentment they would have toward themselves. So what they're looking for is a sense of superiority or maybe a sense of satisfaction from their current circumstances. They're trying to escape from that, and they're trying to say, I'm going to put myself on a high horse and compare myself to somebody else and say I'm better. And I'm going to say, you need to get your stuff in order. Okay, if I don't have my stuff in order, it's going to make me feel good by pointing out inadequacies of other people. That's the easiest thing in the world to do. So there's a point from Dostoevsky that kind of, it's a quote actually that encapsulates this very well. He says, nothing is easier than to demonize the evildoer. Nothing is more difficult than to understand him. So when we project at people. It's frequently something that is unsettling within ourselves, and we see it in other people. So that's been frequently said. Every single individual is a mirror. I'm going to see in you, you're going to see in me what you value and dislike in yourself, and you're going to see those in other people. And we know this. We can substantiate this personally. If you see a I don't know, a public figure, somebody might resent them, somebody might idolize them, somebody might be indifferent to them, somebody might see, oh, I value that person because of their hard work. Somebody might say, oh, they don't deserve what they earned. They're lucky. They're celebrity. You know what I mean? There's all these different interpretations on this one similar objective event. We can both look at a person and make completely different moral judgments and ethical judgment about their character, and you can just revert this back to the individual. You know, what I'm saying has nothing to do with the object that we're looking at. What I'm saying is actually reflection of how I believe myself to be. But what I'm doing is displacing my traits that I'm not okay with admitting, or they're uncomfortable to admit in myself, or it's a lot of shadow work, or it's a lot of murky waters that I don't want to look into because I know it's just opening a rabbit hole that I have to do a lot of internal work on. So instead of doing all that, it's a lot easier for me to just say, oh, that person needs to get their act together. That's a lot easier. And you get the same temporary sense of satisfaction. You get this same sense of like temporary superiority from doing that. And I think that's the motivating narrative behind that. But again, this is transitory, and it's only going to, I guess, resurface in every single relationship we have. So it would be useful to turn that inward, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes here in the application. So another idea is from Peterson. So he actually talks about a lot controversial points. So he says ideas like, so going back to this projection for a second. So we say, oh, I could never do that like immoral thing if I was in that person's shoes. I would never be that type of person. I'm better than that, et cetera, et cetera. And he counteracts this. He says, no, you probably wouldn't. So he uses like Nazi Germany, for example. And he says, if you were alive in Nazi Germany, you would very likely be a Nazi yourself. And people like to not entertain that, and they say, I could never do those things, right? But if enough like social situations, if enough internal cues, if enough mandations from government and society and people in power were kind of encouraging you or even forcing you to think or act a certain way, you would very likely conform. And it's easy, like I said, to project ourselves and say, I think I'm this way, therefore I would never do that. And this can be substantiated through multiple other modalities rather than just like Nazi Germany. There's a book called Ordinary Men by Robert Browning. And it actually, I get this recommendation from Peterson. I haven't read the book myself, but I've seen him talk about it. And it actually describes this journey of ordinary men, hence the title, that were kind of bred and conditioned and indoctrinated to become these murderous machines who were executing hundreds of people a day. And they began as like not really that malevolent of individuals. They were just these ordinary men. Another example is the famous Stanford prison experiment. We like to think that we are these noble, conditioned and civilized people, but given social cues, given certain circumstances, our repressed traits, our shadow is going to surface. And again, I think it's very easy to project and say, I'm a good person, I would never do these things. But you don't really know until you've faced that shadow within yourself. You don't really know until you are up against the circumstances. You don't really know until you have an external tool to illuminate the attributes and characteristics that you might have repressed or you might be too afraid to accept within yourself. And those circumstances are just tools to reflect them back to you. So this leads me to the third point in this discussion, and we are going to go into the application. So what can we, learn from Candide and optimism? What can we learn from the approach of individualism or collectivism? What can we learn from projection, displacement, etc.? How can we apply these principles to improve our lives? So the first point that I have is to simply, set your corner of the universe in order. So I think that was a very fruitful paragraph to pull from Peterson. Address your own responsibilities that you should have in life. So going over a few of them briefly: have you made peace with your brother? Are you treating your spouse and children with dignity and respect? Do you have habits that are ensuring your health and well-being? Are you shouldering your responsibilities? Another question, another approach can be like, what are you repressing? What are you denying yourself of? Like, what's a sneaking suspicion that you have about yourself or about your life, or something that you've entertained, like you've had an impulsive thought, but you just don't want to go there because like it's too deep, it's too I don't know, it's fear, it's promoting fear. You might be doubtful, you might not know that you have the capacity to surmount or address that thought within yourself. You might not be willing to look at yourself in that light, right? You might not want to even address your shadow in that way. You might want to only think of yourself as like a benevolent, you know, completely compassionate and empathetic person, but maybe picture yourself in a mental experiment. Okay, what would it take for me to get, you know, be a malevolent person? You know what I mean? That's a useful thought experiment. I'm not saying like, obviously, like conceptualize these until they become reality. I'm saying like, picture yourself in these individuals' mental state and say, what would it take for me to get there? Because that person very likely didn't start out there. I think Ordinary Men is, again, a book that completely fortifies and ossifies this idea. It's like, not everybody is kind of born these malicious and malevolent people. They are bred. Okay, evil, as Socrates says, ignorance is the only evil. So I think that's a certain place to start. Address our responsibilities, address like whatever we are repressing, address our shadow side of ourselves that we've never looked at before out of fear or out of doubt. I think that can be one application. A second application can be turn our frustrations and our judgments of other people inwards. So again, I said earlier, whatever you think of other people, it's never about the other people. They're always a mirror reflecting you back to yourself. So if you say, okay, this person is, I've actually thought of it, I found a thought experiment, I brought this up in a previous meetup, that really proves this point. And I don't know if there's like complete validity in it, but I do see merit in it. And the experiment was as follows. Think of somebody that you really admire, like a hero, or somebody that like they surmounted a lot of obstacles. You really admire them. They have like a classic, maybe a rags to riches story or something, or they have really, you know, admirable characteristics and attributes. Think of that person. Okay, write a letter to that person. Just write like everything that you admire about him. Or him or her. I admire you because you do this. I love this about you. I praise you for that. Okay, that's one sheet of paper. Second sheet of paper, think of somebody that really frustrates you, really grinds your gears. It could be a coworker, somebody that you think is, you know, childish, immature. You can't stand the way they act or think or speak. It's just like thinking of them just really, really annoys you for whatever reason. And then write that on a separate piece of paper. I hate that you do this. I hate when you do that. This really bothers me about you. Okay, and then you take those two sheets of paper and you write two, like you're addressing it to somebody, and you write yourself on the top of the paper. So like you see all of those positive attributes in yourself, which is why you project them on the other person. And what you hate about person B is what you actually don't like about yourself. Okay. And again, this can be useful because if I met the person that you hate, I might not hate them. I might be like, oh, they're kind of cool. You're like, whatever. It's always going to be a reflection of how you feel in yourself. And they are just a canvas. They are just the tool to illuminate your character back to you. Because it's very easy for us. It's very difficult for us to completely go intrinsic and like address all of these things. And it's easy for us to displace and psychologically project and look at things as externals and not take responsibility for. So again, going back to the collectivism. So I think that could be another application, like turn this frustration or admiration, or like, I think frustration can be better in terms of growth. So turn frustration, like somebody who really bothers you, turn those projection inwards. Instead of saying, I hate you because you're this, think about what that's illuminating about yourself. Why do you hate that? And then do your internal work so it's no longer going to bother you. And then the third point is from Peterson, is it's leading by example. So influence and lead people by example. So it's one thing to say, I think you should get your act together in terms of your relationships. But if it's like, if I have a tumultuous relationship at my house, my words are hollow, right? It doesn't mean anything. I haven't substantiated, I haven't turned my information into knowledge and wisdom. I haven't implemented any of my philosophies. Therefore, that would be completely hypocritical. So in short, practice what you preach. And again, people, if you really want to change people, you need to lead by example, because that will make your words, that'll breathe life into your words. It's taking the words from just conceptual ideas in the realm of thought, and it's instantiating them with mass, right? And I've talked about this on a past meetup, the Quack Frog. So the Quack Frog it's an Aesop's fable, where it's this physician, and he's a frog, and he's saying, I have cures for all diseases. I can heal everyone. I can heal everyone. Everybody come to me. I can heal your ailments. I can purify you. And then somebody points out and they say, but look at your, what do they say, blotched skin or something like that, and like you're sick yourself basically. So it's like you're not practicing what you preach. So why would I hold any merit and utility in your words? They're all hollow. Everything you say is hollow. So I think the best way, if we want to facilitate change, even if it's on like a global scale issue or a issue that's in terms of a community, the best way to do that is not to say or blame other people and blame this group and blame that person or blame a particular party or society. It is to address that within yourself. It's to turn that frustration inwards and then say, okay, I'm going to lead by example. And then you can, once you set your corner of the universe in order, as the bees and the birds and the flowers and plants do, you can then influence maybe your relationships. You can, and then influence your family. Then you can influence your coworkers. Then you can influence maybe your company. Then you can influence maybe your industry, right? And this is a ripple effect that goes on, but it only starts if you adopt your own responsibility and set your corner of the universe in order. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Shrikant now. He's going to moderate Q&A.
All right, folks. So we have 4 rules that we have used for 4 years. Number 1, type exclamation mark when you want to talk. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, be courteous. Feel free to speak your mind, but do so courteously. Next up is going to be Cotton, followed by Joe. Cotton, go ahead. Give me just a second. I'm going to change the settings so you can unmute yourself. Go ahead, Cotton.
Yes, I had a question. This kind of goes, well, you know, what about the people who don't tend their own gardens, but they're helping everyone else but themselves? And I see that kind of prevalent in the current society. You know, everybody is into this help these people movement, help these people movement. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of people suffering themselves, you know, mental health, whatever. So what's going on there? And do you find that people who do tend their own gardens tend to help other people, or they're just comfortable in their kind of immediate surroundings?
Very good question. Thank you. So to the first point, I mean, people that exclusively, I don't know about exclusively, but for sake of argument, let's say exclusively like help other people cultivate their garden. There's actually when I was doing research looking for that Jordan Peterson like paragraph, I found a video on YouTube of him. And it's kind of actually talking about this point, collectivism. I mean, I don't think he uses the phrase exclusively, but he said people do that. Like people shoulder their responsibility and say like, oh, you guys should do this, or they adopt what he called a pseudo-moralistic viewpoint or stance in order to try to look better and appear better to their peers. And the alternative to this would be helping their self. So I think that could be a reason, that could be a motivating reason to do that, because one, it's easier. Like I would argue it's easier to do that than like say help somebody get their stuff together rather than like address your own insecurities, because that's uncomfortable. It takes a lot more effort. It takes a lot more toil. It takes a lot more honesty. It takes a lot more self-awareness, right? It takes a lot more resources to address your shadow than to just say somebody else, hey, you know, get your life in order. That's a lot more easy. And you get the sense of superiority, you get satisfaction, you get social status in a sense of a hierarchy way more expedient and way more quicker than you would if you did it yourself. But again, I think that is shallow. And as you pointed out brilliantly, those people get drained by that. It's not a sustainable approach, I wouldn't say. Now, there's nothing wrong in altruism. Okay. I'm not arguing against this at all. I'm not saying only focus on you and at the expense of any other people. I'm saying the most effective way for altruism is to fill your cup first. You can't pour from an empty cup. You can't teach something you do not know. You cannot share anything you don't have, right? So the first duty is to yourself. It might sound selfish, but even for an altruist, the first duty is to yourself. So then you can provide what you have to other people. To be able to provide to other people, you need to have an excess. You need to have an excess of time, attention, resources, money, whatever resource it is you're giving to somebody, you need to have an excess. So in order to get that excess, you have to first address yourself. I think that's the only really sustainable and truly impactful way to influence other people is, again, by example.
Next up is Joe. Joe, go ahead.
I mean, I'm actually torn whether to ask a question about Rule 6 based on that last answer, or from Jordan Peterson, or I have to ask you this other question, though. The question is whether the Panglossian perspective of the world, and since I know you know Nietzsche so well, is the idea of love of fate and amore fati, and how does that differ from the Panglossian perspective on reality, that the best of all worlds versus loving your fate? And I do see, my personal perspective is that one is more practical and the other one is more of a ideal, where it's kind of just giving everything up. But I know you know the answer to this question, so a great presentation again. Thank you.
Thank you. I like that question. That's a very good one. So when I was like, I actually kind of entertained, I tried to put myself in Pangloss's position when I was reading it. And I was like, okay, how could, because I do like to have somewhat of a constructive attitude and like, not like overly optimistic, but I would say like in my personal life, when I come across an obstacle or like I come across a defeat or a failure, I say, okay, what's the seed of equivalent advantage of this? Like someone might call that blind optimism. Someone could be like, no, you're not addressing the actual failure. You're trying to be overly optimistic. You're trying to avoid the circumstances, right? So I tried to actually entertain Pangloss's philosophy here, but I would say in terms of me judging his character based off of his actions in the book, or lack of actions more specifically, he was entertaining a sense of philosophical determinism in sense of fate. So he didn't intervene his will at all, which is completely contravening against Nietzsche's idea of amor fati. So love your own fate, but you are always in control of that fate. So I would say that would be like Pangloss was, if he like imbued his will into this is the best of all possible worlds, I might be on board with him. But he was so like beaten down by his circumstances and he did nothing to intervene. I think that's the most important part. He said, this is for the best. Therefore, I'm not even gonna act, because I would mess up the determined future of the world, the future of my outcome, the future of my circumstances. So I'm just going to sit here and meekly acquiesce and accept everything that life throws at me, even though in this novel it's terrible, right? He's almost been hung, he's almost been murdered, he's in a very degraded state, he is poor, he's homeless, he's broken down, but he's just like, I'm not going to do anything because this is for the best of all worlds. This is the best as it can possibly get. That is, I would say, psychologically indolent and weak and lazy. He didn't exert any of his will. He didn't intervene in terms of these circumstances. He didn't take the circumstances and say, I'm going to make the best of these. Okay, make, that implies deliberation, that implies action, that implies exertion of your will. He didn't say, I'm going to make the best of these circumstances. He said, these are the best circumstances. That's a small distinction, but I guess the outcomes are like poles apart, right? So he didn't take any action. He didn't intervene. And I think that's where he went wrong. And that's where I disagree with him. And that's where I fell off with the best of all possible worlds.
Next up is Stefan, Deborah, and Mike. Stefan, go ahead.
Hi. When is it? I'm sorry. Was it Catton? What I understood her was something different. It sounds like she was saying, she was talking about people who help those people around them and then sort of ignore themselves. She wasn't, and I think sounded like John was conflating that with people who say someone should do something, or we have to do this, or this sort of like this call to action but no action. So I thought she was talking about people that take action and in doing so may end up sort of ignoring their own needs and then getting burnt out and that sort of thing. So which I think these are two very different problems. But I would say the people who actually take the action for the people, presumably it's the people close to them, you know, they're making those people part of their garden. Or even if you go, I don't know, you're a missionary or you're a Peace Corps volunteer or whatever, you're going to another country and you're doing these things, you're making that your garden. So I still think there's a difference there where you, and you may be neglecting some own things of your own. I think the other thing would be then is where when you're really tending someone else's field, you're more like a serf, I think. And I would say that would be the people who sort of like, maybe, you know, I would say, for example, people that, you know, on social media are calling this, they're actually sort of building the fields of that, whoever owns that platform, or whoever owns that medium or something. They're actually sort of working for them in a way. But that's how I saw what Pat was saying.
Yeah, that is a good point. I mean, you can absolutely extend like your area of competence and responsibility to include other people in it. Absolutely. Like other people can be part of your garden. You know, if you look at yourself like like you were saying, you travel to different countries and you do all these things, you're altruist, you work for a nonprofit, et cetera, XYZ. But I would say if you start to see, like, if you start to notice that you are not energized and you are drained by that, I would look at that as an indicator that you're using those things to mask, or you're using those things to distract yourself from your own internal work. Right. So I think I'm saying to effectively include other people in your garden, you have to cultivate your own first. And now that might take the shape of other things like articulating to yourself your purpose in order to include those other people in your purpose, you know, addressing your shadow, addressing all of these negative things that you wanted to avoid in your former years of your life, addressing the things that you've repressed, you know, traumatic things that you've just buried and you never addressed or grown from. You've just put them aside and just buried a bunch of distractions and escapism philosophies onto that. So I'm saying the most effective way to include other people in the garden is to first address that garden. And I think an indicator that would something that would indicate whether we worked on our garden or not is if we felt drained by that, like helping other people, I would think that would be an indicator that we didn't do our work first. You know what I mean? And if we were energized by that, all means keep going.
Next up is Deborah.
Okay, so this is kind of a two-part question, but I feel like they're related. So you were talking about the idea, this is sort of similar to actually two of the questions that were asked before. This idea about like, if other people will say like, I'm not gonna listen to you, you don't have your life together. I mean, they do that. People often do that, I think, because maybe they don't wanna look at themselves either. But like, if you're secure in yourself and like you're self-aware and maybe you realize, okay, like you do have flaws, but like, that's fine. If people want to take your advice or not, whatever. Shouldn't it be sort of like, okay, well, maybe that shouldn't get to you? Like, I guess it's just, you know, it's a personal decision. But I would think like, you know, if you have self-confidence, like, yeah, like, all right, whatever. Like, I don't need to let these people like tear me down, I guess. And then I guess the other part would be, in terms of those lists that you were mentioning, I was wondering if you meant them to apply them like, in an interpersonal way, like people you actually know, like people that you admire and people that like really annoy you or you don't like. I was thinking like there are people I've never met, but they may, because they're in power or something, they might still have an influence over my life. And I might really feel that I dislike this person for valid reasons, I think, but it doesn't mean that necessarily reflects things in my life. It's just they're doing something that could hurt me or other people or something like that. Mm-hmm. That's it.
Yeah, so to the first point, I mean, what I understand from it, it's kind of like, are you saying we might not always have to take advice from people who have the results? Is that kind of a good summary of the first part?
Sort of the opposite. Like if you're, you know, interacting with someone or offering them advice and they would say, well, you know, you're not perfect, basically. Like, I'm not sure that that should make us as individuals shrink away from that because other people would say like whatever, you're not perfect, basically. I'm not sure it means you don't have anything to offer, but I also don't know that it should necessarily influence you to the point that it affects you, like your self-esteem, I guess, if that makes sense. It's
kind of, yeah.
Reflecting too, like, yeah.
Yeah. So I personally always I try to go that route, and I'm not saying I look at people in terms of a totality. So it's like if somebody says to me, you should get your, I don't know, you should figure out your relationship like conditioning or something. It's like, I'm going to look at where their relationships are. I'm not going to say like, are you perfect as a person? Or do you have a good career? Or do you make a lot of money? Are you successful in your family life? You know what I mean? Like that's all irrelevant in terms of like where they're coming from in their, like, I'm trying to look at what led to their conclusions that they're sharing. Do you know what I mean? Like what led to that philosophy that they're sharing them? Like, was it something that they read? Was it something that they've experienced? I would prefer experience because that has a lot more weight than just like hollow information that I've read from a book or that I've just learned from a podcast or something. Like if they'd apply it, there's a lot more nuance. There's a lot more context. So like typically when somebody tries to give me advice, I'm like, okay, you're giving me advice in this realm. Okay, what's that realm look like in your life? You know, like what are your beliefs around that realm? How did they form? Like how much work have you done in that realm? Like, are you really experienced in that realm? Or are you just trying to like feel good by telling me to do something? You know what I mean? Because there are people like that. So yeah, I typically try to approach it that way. And yeah, the second part, I would say yes. Like I said in the presentation, I want to make it black and white. You know what I mean? I don't want to like polarize everything. There is validity in that. Like I do see what you're saying. Like somebody in power or some like person you never met, they might really, really bother you because of something that they do. And kind of similar in Candide's situation, there was all of these external obstacles that he had completely no control over, right? Like an earthquake or like a fire or like famine or like military intervention into a city that they destroyed and like robbed and killed everybody. And then I would focus on whatever's in your locus of control, right? So it's like, what can you do about that? People can have the option of, you know, being bitter, being resentful, maybe saying, I don't like this person, and really dwelling on it. But that's kind of disempowering if it's gone on too long. If it's allowed to propagate, it's very disempowering. And it kind of just pulls you away from your ruling power, as Aurelius would say. So paying attention to everything that you have no control of, if you do that enough, it's very disempowering. It's very limiting in terms of like what we can actually do. And then I've made this argument off of, you know, Candide, because I think it's a really good example. There's so much out of his control. And he says, okay, what can I do? Cultivate my garden. And it's like symbolic to like, okay, put my life in order. And it's like, I'm going to start influencing people around me. I have this little community. I have 2 friends and a mentor. I'm going to be the best possible version of myself. So then I'm going to lead out as a ripple effect. I'm going to lead by example. You know what I mean? The world's not perfect by any means. Like these earthquakes are still happening. There's people still dying, but like I'm doing what I can. So.
Next up is Mike, followed by Moira. Mike, go ahead. Mike, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted.
Go ahead.
This is quite apropos considering what the turmoil in our elections in this country right now. Hobbes and Locke and Voltaire and Rousseau were part of a cabal of Enlightenment thinkers that inspired the American Revolution, British Civil War, and the French Revolution. And I guess the concept of how it all ties together is floating in my mind, that not too clearly, that collectivism offers utopia, but eventually leads to the guillotine and burning down the civilization. And I just wonder, now people saw that and well, not people, but the government saw that and put Voltaire in jail for a period of time, and he did get discredited for a while. I just wonder what you think of that. And Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan, and there's another, and Leibniz, the guy who invented calculus, is thought to be Pangloss. Have you found some of those cues in your reading of this book?
Interesting. So first of all, thank you. I always appreciate your like historical backgrounds to whatever we're reading, because that's like one of my least, I guess, explored points is like the context in which things are written. So like whatever political events they inspired or whatever civilizations they helped form, that's like my weak point. I actually have Leviathan here. I have not read it. It's on my to-read list. So I unfortunately don't have much of comment in terms of what you proposed, but thank you for the input. I haven't really looked at the context surrounding these thinkers, surrounding the Enlightenment era, but it's on my list. So I look forward to that, and thank you.
So let me add a few things. Enlightenment is a very special time. Enlightenment is basically when the achievements of science begin to kind of spread out into the culture, so that people start thinking about things that they didn't explicitly think about. So people like, the evil or the bad character in this, he's kind of an example of the past way of thinking, where you're just passing off these platitudes ideas that are taken for granted. Whereas Voltaire and Enlightenment, Voltaire is particularly good at it. You know, he has a very sharp, clear, crisp mind with a tremendous sense of humor. He's able to actually point to reality of things underneath the, you know, kind of the human realities. You know, he's able to use his mind to actually engage human experience and make fresh observations about what is going on, as opposed to people before him in humanities that just offered their theories and platitudes as if they were truths. So that's the play that is going on in Enlightenment, and Enlightenment is a giant step forward. It definitely inspired. You know, that's the foundation of our you know, founding fathers and formation of America, where, for example, you know, saying that you can figure out what's a good way of governing ourselves. Now that's unheard of in the old world before Enlightenment, because everybody thought that, of course, we have a king, and what else can you do? We can just hope that the king is good. But the idea of self-government implies a level of individualism, ability of people to think for themselves and to create a government that makes it possible for them to flourish. So definitely America is a child of Enlightenment. So the next one up is Moira. Moira, go ahead.
Hi, bit nervous, but here we go. Fantastic intro speaker. And I was thinking that with your comparison of bees to humans, that bees have specialized jobs and they're born into those roles. And I feel, or, you know, sort of history sort of shows that, you know, there's not a homogeneity of capacity in the human race. And I wonder if too, we've evolved to have specialized groups that do certain functions that work together for the whole. And then I thought of the role of the thinker, the intellectual person who creates culture. And as that happens, it seems to be a dynamic process that's ongoing. You have people who are positing sort of ideas for the society that are sort of empowering and protective and sort of nurturing for the group. And then you have other people who are proposing ideas that are oppressive and exploit the group. And I was thinking about World War II and how Hitler brought out Mein Kampf, and then hardly anyone read it, but a few key people did, including Churchill. So Churchill read the book and understood the mind of Hitler, even though he didn't share the mind of Hitler, and knew right from having read that book that this guy was going to be unstoppable. There was no negotiating with him or persuading, or, you know, that it was going to be a fight to the end between Hitler's idea of how the world should be run and how the West should. So I guess, and then I see that played out with Stalin, with Pol Pot, with Mao Zedong. So these kind of battles at that intellectual group happen continuously. And I think what seems to me is the focus, or what you were saying, is kind of like getting the whole demos involved in this enterprise. And I think that they're too busy doing their very valuable roles as well. And unless people involved in this battle of ideas are active and sort of involved, you know, you allow the other side to win. And I feel like in some way that's why the Enlightenment's been derailed recently, is that most of us thought it's I lay down misere, it's the battle's been won, it's a wonderful system, let it just roll. And then it's been undermined. And yeah, so I guess I'm putting to you how you feel. The other thing is that I think bad people are, or I don't think.
Moira, go ahead and ask your question. You've given a good background. Just go ahead and ask a question.
Okay. Well, would you find it a correct assessment to say, or in that people with these kind of traits of dominance, competitiveness, exploitation are actually kind of genetic types that are always in any society, and then they're sort of going to experience pushback from a different type that's sort of high on this compassion, conscientiousness, you know, take care of other people. and that there's always this ongoing battle. If the bees that are on, you know, the side of good and light always lay around in bed, then that's how you allow the bees who are on this other side of taking everybody else for granted and exploiting them take the upper hand.
Yeah, so that's a very good context. It's very good interpretation and analysis. I do agree with you. I think there are large genetic predispositions to particular temperaments, attributes, characteristics, lifestyles, etc. I mean, this has been pretty well established in like the Big Five, for example. They've kind of somewhat traced it back to genetics. But with that said, I wouldn't personally look at things as like so bifurcated, like, you know, good versus evil, you know, higher versus lower, etc. I do think there is like, I tend to look at individuals in terms of like a puzzle piece. Like, so as you were kind of espousing earlier with like the bumblebees, so they are inherently born into, like, they know exactly what they're supposed to do, right? Like, this is your clear task. You have no other option. I mean, arguably every animal does this. You have no other option but to fulfill your role. And they do, right? Because they don't have a cognitive capacity to entertain the potentiality of different roles. Okay, you know, we as humans, we can say, okay, I want to try this out. I don't like it. I want to try that out. I'm scared to try that out. Maybe I should. Maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. People are gonna influence me to try this, etc. X, Y, Z. We bounce back and forth. So I think I would turn the question and turn the answer and say, I think we should all be on an intrinsic quest to find our corner of the universe. And I think the way that we would do this is, at least the way I try to approach is like through the, I don't know, negative or undesirable emotions as indicators. So when I do something, or if I don't do something, I notice it more importantly when I don't do something and I feel guilty, or I feel like I could be doing more in my life, or I feel like I should have, I don't know, I should have taken action on something and I didn't. And I feel that little like seedling of regret or something like that. That is more of an indication that I'm off track of my corner of the universe. Okay. And the more I'm reconciled and the more I am at a state of fulfillment and passion and pride, I would say authentic, like justified pride, I'm putting my corner of the universe in order in that way. And then by putting my corner of the universe in order, I begin to more effectively, I guess, outline and put myself in the puzzle piece of humanity, and then influence the people around me, and then influence the people around me that way and that way and that way. And that, of course, extrapolates and compounds. But I personally look at the like negative emotions as indicators, you know what I mean? And like the other negative emotions can be like doubt and fear. If I want to take an action, if I think of doing something, like, I don't know, let's say I'm in sales, I want to approach somebody and make a sale. I'm fearful, I'm doubtful, because like whatever voice in the back of my head tells me not to. That's an indicator that I need to take action, because all that voice is doing is trying to keep me in my comfort zone, because my primate brain wants to keep me safe, and it ensures survival, and that's all its job is, right? Survival. And we haven't really outgrown that primitive conditioning yet. So we still have these old brains with this new society, if you will. So I look at those other negative emotions as doubt, fear, worry, anxiety, etc., as indicators that I need to do something, and I need to do it quick, or else those things are going to eat me alive.
Next up is Chachi. Chachi, go ahead. Chachi, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay. I guess I was going back to the question of projection and the question of would I never be a Nazi because I recognize a Nazi, or would I never be a Nazi because I see the Nazi in me, and that's how I recognize a Nazi? Because I think it speaks to the question of degrees of separation, where I can be influenced by someone who's 1 degree of separation, but if I have to extrapolate that to immediately think of someone who's 6 degrees of separation, I might be able to say, no, I would never jump 6 steps ahead, but I can easily see myself making baby steps, going a small step here, a small step there, and then it becomes a slippery slope. So I'm wondering if that is the slope, the same sort of slope that we talk about when we go from individualism to collectivism, where, you know, I only have so much control and so much self-control as far as I can like project to the next step before it's a slippery slope, and I'm either down one path or the other of individualism or collectivism?
Yeah, so very good question. And I'm going to actually bring it back to Peterson's Rule 6, set your house in perfect order before you try to criticize the world, for the answer. So after that paragraph that I said a little bit earlier, he says, consider your circumstances, start small, take care of all the stuff you have to take care of. And he says, have you cleaned up your life? If the answer is no, here's something to try. One simple sentence. Stop doing what you know to be wrong. That's simple enough, but it's what's simple to do is also very simple to neglect, right? Because it's so small. And then I think he would argue that, like, okay, that 5th to 6th degree of separation, that might look like, let's go back to, you know, Nazi Germany or something, like an extreme example. That 5th to 6th degree or step might manifest in, do I kill 2 people or do I kill 3 people, right? It's like, yeah, that's not that much big of a step. And then I think Peterson might argue that, like, the first step of, like, I don't know, accepting to enroll in a service is just as bad as accepting to pull that trigger. It's the same step. It doesn't matter, like, the magnitude of it. It's inherently, like, it's against your voice of your conscience. It's something that you knew, you established, you believe to be something, like, morally true, and you betray it. You do something that made you feel weak, or you do something that you knew to be wrong. That is where you went wrong. It doesn't matter, like, the degrees, I would argue. So in that sense, like, we all have this internal voice of conscience. We all have this internal vocalizing mechanism of intuition that suggests us that we should do or shouldn't do certain things. And I think it is typically wise to mostly adhere to it. Or I would say mostly. And that's kind of the whole argument behind this entire chapter, is, like, you know that you're doing things, you know that you're not accepting as much responsibility as you should in life. You know you can be doing more in terms of, like, reconciling your relationship with your partner. You know that you could be adopting more jobs at your workplace. You know that you could do more in all aspects of your life, but you don't. Why don't you? So, like, I think we should all ask ourselves that question. That's a good approach to lead to lasting change. And if enough individuals do that, that's when we see profound change in terms of a societal scale, instead of everybody just saying, I'm good, I'm not even going to focus on these things inside me because they make me feel uncomfortable, and I'm just going to project outward. Or I'm just going to, like, I'm not going to engage in the tasks that I know I should engage in because they're difficult. And I think that's like the entire meaning that I got out of this entire chapter, is, like, stop doing things that make us feel weak. Stop doing things that we know to be wrong, no matter how small they are. No matter how small they are, we shouldn't betray our voice of conscience or intuition. Even if the consequence is trivial, even if it doesn't even affect anybody at all in a negative way. We should, if we know it's wrong, we should not do it.
Next up is Jeff. Jeff, go ahead.
Hey, John. Thanks for a great presentation. I put my question here in the chat, and I didn't want to be too long with it, but I wanted to try to be precise. So I don't know if you can see it, but after, you know, having pronounced my own share of either or judgments earlier in my own philosophical journey, such as absolute good or evil, or individual versus collective responsibility, I've really changed my own orientation to assume more of a both and sense of the likely truth, and have become really cautious, even vigilant, regarding the application of absolutes. So, for example, you know, I don't need to choose between the garden of one's own life having been perfectly or imperfectly tended, and whether or not somebody might be a victim of policies such as, you know, a completely unnecessary war where bombs kill both them and their family, and they're thus victims, not in a sense responsible for their own deaths. They could have led their own lives better, and they're responsible for whatever they could have done and the results, but they were also the victims of actions of others. So it just seems to me that to assume absolutes one way or the other is both unwise as well as untrue. And so, in the spirit of wanting to be wiser and more embracing of the way things really are, it's a both and orientation to me seems more generally applicable. And I'm wondering if that is is in conflict with the way you see this writing.
No, I
Thanks.
don't think it's in. Thank you. I don't think it's in conflict. I just say, I mean, my viewpoint on it is just mostly, I would say mostly individualism over collectivism if we're trying to facilitate change in the world. You know, of course, there's always exceptions to rules. That's why I always try to refrain from saying always or never. I personally agree with that statement. Like, there are exceptions, there are like little contexts and nuances, but I'm saying mostly, and I use examples of like, okay, if we're trying to facilitate change in the world, the best way to do that, most likely, like 9 times out of 10, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, 9 times out of 10 would be to set your corner of the universe in order and then extend from that. And this is, you know, ossified from, you know, my experience with Peterson and like the videos that I've seen and like him kind of explaining this point. I mean, again, he doesn't, I don't know that he directly addresses this point of like, okay, individualism versus collectivism exclusively. I don't know if he like actually articulates that in terms of those words, but I can extrapolate it from like, for example, this chapter. And he's saying, okay, what should we do about the malevolence of the world? Yes, you can make the argument we're all victims of things that we don't, that we're not of our hand. Right? Like other people doing things to us, other societies, other laws doing things to us. Okay, sure. But again, my answer to Deborah was like, we can dwell on these things, or we can cultivate our garden. We can focus on what we can do, what we can control. And that's whatever we can control. I would say it's in our garden. And then facilitate that, create that, improve that, and then expand outward. And that's the way to facilitate change. And again, 9 times out of 10, I would say individualism is always the better approach. But is there room for interpretation? Is there room for a devil's advocate? Is there room for a contrary viewpoint? Absolutely. You know what I mean? Absolutely.
Right, John, it's time to go to breakout rooms. So what are the questions for the breakout room?
Yes, so I have 3. The first one is, what can you guys think of for examples as individualism as being effective? So in practical terms of like cultivating your garden and then helping other people, what are some practical ways or areas of life that this can apply to? What are some examples of individualism as being effective? Second question, what are the motivating reasons behind individualism or collectivism in approach to the malevolence or evil of the world? What is the motivating reasons that one might engage in individualism or collectivism? And the third approach is actually kind of related to Jeff's question. Can collectivism be a better approach in some examples? And what are those examples? So those are 3 questions. Examples of individualism as being effective, the motivating reasons behind both approaches, and can collectivism be a better approach to some issues? And if so, which ones?
All right, so we're going to start the breakout rooms.